Climate change has become a widely discussed problem at the moment, and it's a reason why many people have decided to become vegan.
First of all, I'd recently gone on the youth climate change march, and I realised that that animal products actually contribute a lot to global warming and climate change.
The focus on the climate impact of especially the meat industry has led many people concerned about our environment to turn vegan. However, fish are quite often seen more as victims of our environmental problems due to the high levels of plastics and pollutants in our oceans and rivers being very harmful to all creatures who live there. Therefore, I want to look at the effects of different species and the problems the fishing industry both causes and faces to better find out the answer to the question, how can we maximise sustainability in the fishing industry?
Decided to film this episode, I got in touch with lots of different fishing companies, and it was really interesting to hear their views and their ways of doing things. And one group sent me these, and these are two fishing reports about Sweden, although it can relate to the UK because we've got a similar climate and we're relatively similar geographically, and it compares the environmental impact of fishing different species with their nutritional value to see if it's worth fishing the different species. And it's just really interesting because I never thought before how different each species could be. But it's not just the different species that are different, because obviously if you're fishing from different geographical locations, there'll be different amounts of toxins in the water which will affect the nutritional value, and it also depends on where the species is located, because that depends on how much fuel you have to use on the ship to try and get to where they're located. And the nutritional value is dependent on the deficiencies in that specific area. Like some darker areas will be deficient in vitamins like vitamin D, and other areas won't be. And your deficiencies also depend on things like genetics, age, gender, so it's very complicated. So I don't know really how I'm going to make a coherent documentary on this, but it's interesting to read. And what I found is that within some types of fish, like flatfish, they really vary in nutritional value, but the environmental impact is very similar. So obviously it's clear which flatfish you'd prefer to get, the one with like the higher nutritional value, but because they're just above average in environmental impact, then it's probably best to get a more consistent things like pelagic fish like herring and mackerel, because they have a relatively low environmental impact and a high nutritional value, so it's recommended that we have more of them. But just because a species has a lower nutritional value, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should avoid it if it has a really low environmental impact, because this can easily be resolved if you just have a higher portion of it, because then there'll be higher levels of vitamins in a bigger portion than a smaller portion. It's very complicated. I don't really know how to make any valid points on this, but I'm going to learn more. So this company also, I sent some questions about how they carry out their fishing, because I thought you can see from a general perspective from reports which fish are best, but you can't really see how this would be put into practice and how this knowledge is used to make the fishing industry a better and more sustainable place. So I asked them, place, we forgot that, because place is a type of fish. Anyway, moving on, that was not, I didn't aim to make that pun anyway. So I got in touch with North Atlantic Fishing, and they're the ones that sent me these two reports, and I sent them 3 questions. And here's what they said, and I am reading it out. It is my voice. They don't just sound very weirdly like me, just in case you're wondering, which you're probably not. What is your fishing process, and what environmental implications does each stage have?
North Atlantic is mainly involved in pelagic fishing, i.e. mackerel, herring, blue whiting and horse mackerel. These are species that swim in large shoals in the water column, and it is therefore necessary to catch these fish with mid-water trawls. The advantage of a mid-water trawl is that, as the name suggests, the net does not drag along the seabed, and therefore damage to habitats on the seabed is eliminated. Once the fish are caught, they are brought on board and instantly frozen, whole, and packaged in cartons. There are no further processes. The fish that we are catching are large in volume, and stocks are measured by EU scientists to ensure that they are kept at sustainable levels, taking into account fishing activity. A single female mackerel produces between 200,000 to 300,000 eggs. Therefore, the fish population is able to rapidly replenish itself.
How easy will it be to continue fishing, considering the effects of climate change and plastics on the fishing population?
It is not certain what the final effects of climate change will be. However, there does seem to be evidence that as waters around Europe are gradually warming, the fish that we catch are moving further north into colder waters. This obviously means slightly longer voyages in vessels, which need to be constructed to spend longer periods away in often heavy northern seas. We have not noticed an effect of ocean plastic on the health of fish populations. However, we are part of a fishing industry initiative to collect any plastics that we recover at sea and then return them to land to be recycled.
Where do you hope the fishing industry's position will be within the food industry in the future?
I believe that fishing should have a more prominent place within the food industry, alongside aquaculture and sustainable farming practices. Fish, such as mackerel, contain long-chain omega-3 fatty acids and are high in protein, essential for brain development in children, vital for a healthy diet, and with potential benefits not identified by medicine yet. However, the UK as a nation barely eats mackerel or herring. We need to make better use of sustainable sources of food which have a lower environmental impact. All food production will have a level of environmental impact, and move away from CO2 and chemically intensive food production, not just for the health of the environment, but for our own personal health.
So I found it really insightful to see a specific example of a fishing company working around lots of these problems. But now I want to look at the more general picture and look at a company that has a bigger overview of the industry as a whole. So the Marine Conservation Society is the UK's leading marine charity, and I interviewed Debbie Crockard, their senior fisheries policy advocate, to find out about the industry as a whole and what changes are being made to improve the industry.
What problems need solving in the fishing industry?
So the fishing industry is quite a complex area. There's lots of stuff going on. There's lots of different types of fishing. So there's not just one type of fishing across the UK. So what needs to be done is different depending on where you are. But most of what needs to be done can be sort of categorised into groups. So the main one is we need to stop overfishing. So we need to make sure that we're only catching and not as much fish as we can, while still allowing the stock to recover. So we're only taking a sustainable amount of fish out. The other thing that we can do is we can try and limit how many fish that we don't want to catch that we're catching. So we call them bycatch species. So say, for example, if you're fishing for cod, you're not catching something else. And you can do that by being more selective, which is good. And another thing that we can do to that is a problem within the fishing industry is catching things called TEP species. So that's threatened, endangered and protected species. So things like dolphins and turtles and seabirds, trying to make sure that we're not catching them and we're only catching what we're trying to catch. And then the last big one is habitat damage. So trying to reduce habitat damage. And again, the type of habitat damage depends on the type of fishing that takes place. So there are lots of different things that we can do for lots of different types of fishing industry.
You mentioned about being selective when you're fishing. How can you be selective in what species you catch?
So there's lots of different ways we can do it. So it depends on what type of gear you're using. But if you're using, say, a trawl, which is basically a big net that gets pulled along, you can put what are called escape hatches on them. So some animals can escape out of the trawl, or you can make the size of the net bigger so that you're only catching the fish that are big enough to be caught so that small fish can escape. There's also things called separator grids, and these grids are a bit like a fence inside the net, and they allow some things to escape and some things to be caught. So there's lots of different things that you can do. You can also attach things like radio transmitters, so that you know if you've lost your net or if you've lost your gear, you can go and find it again. So there's lots of things that you can do that can make your gear better, and we're trying to promote as much of that as possible.
What changes could be made to make the fishing industry better and more sustainable?
So we can do the things, like I said there, to do with selectivity, but you can also do things like putting CCTV cameras on your boats. And if you've got a CCTV camera, you can see exactly what is being caught, you can see where it's being caught, you can see how much is being caught. And as technology improves, actually you can use, there's the hope anyway, that we could use computers to automatically see what fish are being brought up, see what species they are, and then it gives us a really good indicator of what is being taken out, which is another big step that we could do, for selectivity.
What do you think consumers can do to make better and more sustainable purchases, and in general to improve the fishing industry?
So consumers can play a big part. Choosing sustainable seafood is quite difficult. It's quite a complex issue, but we've tried to make it as easy as possible. So we produce a thing called the Good Fish Guide, and it's a system that's red, amber, green, where red species are the most endangered or the most fished or heavily fished, whereas green are more sustainable, and they're fished in a way that is more sustainable, has less impact on the environment. So what we'd encourage people to do first of all is just not to buy anything from the red list, because a lot of people don't realise that some of the species on the red list are very, very endangered. So things like European eel, for example. So European eel is a species which you still find in shops, but is actually an endangered species. It's more endangered than the panda, which people really don't realise. Eel is a delicacy, so it's not found all over the UK. A lot of people have never tried it, might never have seen it, but it is very popular in some places. And we would definitely encourage people not to eat European eel, because it is a very, very endangered species and we want to see it recover. And there is a lot of work being done to try and recover it, but until it has got to a sustainable level, we would really tell people not to try that. Whereas we've got some really good choices on our green list, which actually is bigger than our red list, which is really, really good already. So you can make a choice for a really nice, healthy stock, a really tasty species as well, and sometimes a lot of the time a little bit cheaper as well if they come from a nice big stock. So your green listed species are really, really a good choice.
And what do you think the fishing industry will be like in the future?
I have a lot of hope for the fishing industry. I've worked in this area for a long time, and I've seen big improvements in this sort of period that I've been here. So in the last 10 to 15 years, the fishing industry are working really hard to try and improve how they fish. What they really need is investment. So they need the government to put money in to try and make fisheries more sustainable, but also to monitor them better, to have better control in fisheries and better enforcement, so that when people are behaving in a way that's not good for the environment, they're being pulled up for it and they're not being allowed to do it. There are some really good things already. So there are things like lights that you can put onto nets that will either attract or scare away species. So if you're trying to limit your catch of things like seals and dolphins and you want to scare them away, sometimes you can put lights on your nets and that'll scare them away from the net. Or you can put things like pingers on, and a pinger is a noise that's a really high-pitched, annoying noise, which seals and dolphins don't tend to like. So they avoid nets and things that have those pingers on them. You can also put things like bird scarers. So a bird scarer does exactly what it says. It scares birds, and it means that they don't get trapped in nets and things like that, which is really positive. So there's a lot of things that can be done, but even things just like avoiding certain areas. So if you know there's an area where there's lots of juvenile and baby fish, or you know that that's where certain species spawns, so where they go to mate, avoiding that and leaving them to mate and leaving the baby fish to grow up to be big fish so that you've got more fish coming into the population is another thing that the fishing industry could definitely do more of. Anyway, they do a little bit of it now, but there's definitely more they could do. So I think in the future, I'm really quite hopeful. I think our fishing industry will be better. I'm hoping to see the red list getting much smaller and us having much bigger green lists and much more fish available to us that's really sustainable. So yeah, that's where I think the fishing industry could go in the future.
So now I've spoken to the experts, I thought I'd put what I've learned and the resources I've found out about into practice, and I thought I'd give you a few examples of some commonly consumed fish products in the UK. So I awkwardly filmed myself finding some products in the supermarket, and then I'll research them, and obviously I can't research all the fish products because that would make this a really long documentary, but I just thought I'd give you a head start and give you a vague idea of the differences in the different fish products and how you can better educate yourself on them. So it's going to be interesting.
This is pink salmon, and it was caught in the northwest, northeast and western central Pacific, so basically just the Pacific, by gill nets and similar nets, and it was caught in the Pacific as opposed to the Atlantic, where salmon is also found. I've done my research, and I haven't just looked at the Good Fish Guide, which also comes as an app, which is very useful. I'd recommend getting the app if you want to have an easy way to research, but I've also looked online and I've found out that this salmon comes from the Pacific, and in comparison to the Atlantic salmon, it's shorter lived and it also produces more offspring, which means that the population's easier to sustain. And also each female lays 1,000 to 2,000 eggs. I'm not sure if that's in a lifetime or in one go, but it's not that much for a fish. But because the fish reach sexual maturity at age 2, then it kind of balances out. So I felt the need to come back and clarify something here, because it's not necessarily a good thing that they reach maturity at age 2, because despite that being quite a young age, their life expectancy is only around 2 or 3, so they die quite soon after they reproduce, so there's less mature fish, and also the population is targeted a lot by a diverse range of predators. Some target the fry and like the smaller fish, and some target the larger fish, so not many survive and they die quite soon after they reach maturity. So it's not necessarily a good thing that they reach maturity young, because they also die relatively young. And also they're seasonal, so they're in season from late spring to late summer, and this will vary from year to year with obviously weather changes, but it's usually from June to September, but it can also reach into May and October. So that's obviously the best time to get it, unless it's frozen, because then like it's lasting for a longer time, but it's best to get it fresh around late spring to late summer, because then there's more fish available, so they're not catching like from the smaller stock of fish. And also this type of salmon is green on the app, which means that it's the best choice, and if it's caught in traps then it's slightly less sustainable, but it's still a sustainable option in the way the fish is caught. And although it's sustainable in the way it's caught, it's still a species that people are trying to persuade the UK public to stop consuming as much, because it's one of the big 5, and the big 5 is the main 5 species that are consumed in the UK of fish, and it's best to spread out from there, because otherwise there's a risk of overfishing the big 5 if we don't branch out and have more than just 5 fish, because it's best that we're not just taking certain fish out of the ocean, but we're spreading it around a bit. That's not a good description of it. Spreading it round a bit is not a technical term, but yeah, you know what I mean.
This is haddock, caught in the northeast Atlantic, in Barents Sea, the Norwegian Sea, Spitsbergen and Bear Island by trawls.
Completely by coincidence, I picked another fish that's one of the big five. And the big five are haddock, cod, tinned tuna, salmon and prawns. And as over 80% of the consumption of fish in the UK are from these five, it's probably best to branch out. And haddock's a lot more controversial, I found, than salmon, because I found it really difficult to research and find a clear answer, so I just thought I'd share what I found out. So bottom trawls are a common catching method, and this drags along the seabed and causes a lot of damage to the habitat. And also it's not a very selective method, so lots of other unwanted fish can be caught in the process, or like dolphins or turtles, and then they're just discarded. And it's also actually classed on the endangered scale thing as vulnerable. So that means that although it's not endangered at the moment, the levels of fishing at the moment and the fishing methods are unsustainable and could make it extinct if we continue that way. So on that level, I wouldn't really recommend having haddock. However, you could still have it responsibly, because if you just avoid it in March and April especially, but it is also good to avoid it in February to June as well, but this is just when it's fresh, because if you're getting fish from that time, then it's the spawning time, and that's when all of the young fish are around, so you're more likely then to have an immature fish instead of a mature fish. Because when you eat fish, you want to have fish that's mature and it's already reproduced and replenished the stocks of fish a bit. And males reach sexual maturity at age 4 and females reach at age 5, apart from in the Black Sea, when for some reason it's different. I don't know why, but it's a lot younger, because males reach sexual maturity at 2 and females at 3. So that's different. So if you read the packet and it says they were caught in the Black Sea, then you can know that they were younger there at maturity. Also, if they lay quite a lot of eggs, so they're quite sustainable in that way because they produce a lot of offspring, but it varies a lot. So I read that if the fish is 25 centimeters, it will lay approximately 55,000 eggs, and if it's 91 centimeters, it will lay 1,841,000 eggs. So it varies a lot, and I don't know what causes the variations in size, but it's still a lot for fish in comparison to some of the other fish. So it's quite good at reproducing, so it can replenish its stocks relatively well, but it varies a lot with size, so it's a bit difficult to tell. So it's a very confusing fish, so I don't know what we can conclude from that, but I just think it's useful to know both sides so we can make more informed decisions when purchasing haddock. And I never realised it was so complicated, but it really is, so it's good to know.
This is yellowfin tuna, and it was caught in the Indian Ocean using hooks and lines.
Tuna is primarily sold in tins, which means there's a lower demand for fresh tuna, so tuna can be caught in season as there's less demand for it to be caught out of season. And also fish aggregated devices are used to attract the tuna, so less unwanted species are caught and discarded, so there's less waste. And also the methods of catching are quite sustainable because they're quite often caught in the water column, which means that the equipment doesn't drag along the seabed, so the damage to the habitat on the seabed is eliminated. But despite all of this, the population is still near threatened on the endangered scale, which means that it's not endangered or vulnerable or anything, but the population is decreasing, so that's something to bear in mind. So in this documentary we've looked at the very intricate details of the fishing industry, and although that's very interesting and useful, I think it's also good to get an overview of the industry, because we've looked at the different species and some companies, but we haven't looked at the more irresponsible companies and the effect of the industry as a whole. So I've found some statistics and I want to go through them with you so we can get a better overview of the whole industry. So half the ocean's plastics come from fishing, so that shows that there's quite a lot of irresponsible fishing going on. People are leaving their equipment or losing it, so that's not good. And in 2018 there were 12,000 fishermen in the UK, but 2,400 of them were part-time, so it's not a very common industry to be in full-time and to work in that much. And it's also decreasing because the number of vessels is down minus 3.2% from 2008 to 2017. But even though it's become less popular, in 2017 there were still 5.3 million tonnes of live weight fish caught in the EU, so that's loads of fish. That is a lot of fish to get your head around, really. But if you think about it, not all the fish will be consumed because some of it's bones and stuff, so I'm not sure how much fish products that actually equates to and how much just is left for waste. And in 2018, Scotland and Northern Ireland caught mainly pelagic fish, which are the fish like they're caught in North Atlantic Fishing Company, which I interviewed earlier, and those fish are quite good because they have a low environmental impact and high nutritional value, and that's quite good. But in Wales they mainly caught shellfish, which are not that good. They've got low nutritional value, quite a lot of them do, and it's also quite a lot of processes to try and get the fish out. It's just, yeah, it's not too great. And also a more specific fact, but I just found it interesting, it's not really relevant to the industry as a whole, but farmed salmon have 10 times more carcinogenic pollutants in them than wild salmon. So that's a lot more, so it's interesting to see the differences, because I didn't think they'd be that different considering they're all salmon, so 10 times more carcinogens is a lot. So that was a bit surprising, and that's my overview of the fishing industry. So before making this, I was very naive because I didn't realise how different each species and each method was for sustainability and how much variation there is in the industry. And it's a lot of variation and it's really complicated, but what excites me is how much new technology I've heard about and how many positive changes are being made. And I think if we make all conscious decisions and there's more demand for more sustainable fish, people are more likely to do it, and if we invest the money into doing more research we can improve it even further. And I think from a consumer side it's good for you to know when the fish you consume is in season, so you can get your fresh fish in season to avoid eating immature fish by accident. And also it would be good to get the Good Fish Guide app as well if you want to check out some fish when you're out. But obviously we can't do everything, it's a very complex industry, so unless we're like the top experts in the industry we're never going to know everything there is to know and all the complexity to it. But I think as long as we try and we do as much as we can, then that's all that we can do, and hopefully the industry will become more sustainable in the future.